Hi, my name is Tara Kubilai and I'm a psychiatry resident. This is a video about a Netflix series whose main character I analyze in context of narcissistic personality disorder. I'm talking about the 2024 series Ripley and the main character Tom Ripley, portrayed brilliantly by Andrew Scott. All opinions expressed are, of course, my own, and this video is really for entertainment and education purposes. I will leave my sources down in the description box. The show takes place in the 1960s, Italy and New York. The main character, Tom Ripley, is a con artist. He is hired by Vicky Greenleaf's father. They want Tom Ripley to go get their son, convince him to return home, who is living in Italy, doesn't return home for years and years. However, once Tom gets to Italy, plans change and there's fraud and murder. The show was really beautifully shot, especially the scenes in Italy are a pleasure to look at. And because the rest of the video talks about the events of the show, I would highly recommend, if you were considering watching it, do so before you watch this video. Shortly on the history of narcissism, also the name of one of the episodes, Narcissus, is where the word comes from. Narcissus was a Greek mythological figure. He was such a handsome young man that anyone who saw him would fall in love with him. Funny enough, this included himself too. So he sees his image reflected upon a body of water and he falls in love with this, so much so that he can't conceive of having a relationship with anyone else. And he tragically dies from starvation because of having to be attached to this image in his body of water. If he was living now and if he had a front-facing camera on his phone, he probably wouldn't have to die. And it's just funny to think how much the times have changed. I don't think this means that we're all narcissists, but it's a different world. So one of the best descriptions of narcissism was made by a German social psychologist, Erich Fromm. He says, narcissism is an orientation in which all one's interests and passions are directed to one's own person, one's body, mind, feelings, interests, and so forth. For the narcissistic person, only he and what concerns him are fully real. What is outside, what concerns others, is only real in a superficial sense of perception. That is to say, it is real for one's senses and for one's intellect, but it's not real in a deeper sense. He is in fact only aware of what's outside in as much as it affects him. Hence, he has no love, no compassion, no rational, objective judgment. The narcissistic person has built an invisible wall around himself. He is everything and the world is nothing, or rather, he is the world. I love that definition because it captures so much of what narcissistic personality disorder is in a very brief text. I definitely want to talk about trait narcissism so we can make the distinction between trait narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. These are thought to be on a continuum of some sort, but trait narcissism is also considered subclinical or healthy narcissism. Trait narcissism is more akin to entitlement, possibly an inflated sense of self that is usually associated with a dominant personality style. And a lot of people with trait narcissism tend to be high achieving, higher ranking in public positions, outspoken. You can see how this would be necessary to get to a position, especially of leadership, where you think your ideas should be listened to by other people and you're not shy about expressing them. This actually made me think about the whole be delusional trend.
I have tried the logical route. I have tried the emotional route. I am just straight up ready to be delusional.
This would be a sign that it can work. And I think when it does, it leans into trait narcissism being beneficial and people believing in themselves and expressing their thoughts. Like all DSM disorders, narcissistic personality disorder, to be diagnosed would need to be inflexible, maladaptive, persisting, and causing significant functional impairment to the person in order to be considered a disorder. Going back to the show, for a con artist, we can see how having narcissistic traits would be essential because you are in a position where you're lying and creating a reality that you have to sell to other people. And even just to have the assumption that your lies are to be believed over what's real is requiring a lot of reassurance from yourself, I would think. Another reason I wanted to make the distinction between a trait and a disorder is because of what I will call the diagnosing culture going around. We're almost treating psychological traits like zodiac signs, trying to predict how people will behave, or retroactively assigning them certain diagnoses because of their actions. The reason we're talking about this character is based on the assumption that all we see is all we get and there's nothing more, and this is not a real person. In a real life situation, I wouldn't talk about diagnosing a person I have never met, obviously, especially with a personality disorder, where a lot of times you have to see them in a more longitudinal setting and do a thorough assessment. In the DSM-5, narcissistic personality disorder is in the cluster B of personality disorders, along with antisocial, borderline, and histrionic personality disorders. This cluster as a whole is defined to be erratic, emotional, dramatic. Specifically for NPD, the DSM says it's a pervasive pattern of grandiosity in fantasy or behavior, need for admiration, lack of empathy, beginning in early adulthood, present in a variety of contexts. There's 9 criteria, but I picked 5 that I thought were very clearly exemplified by the character that I will mention, though I think you can make a case for probably all 9. The series was our interview with the character, and then this is a DSM, and we're going to kind of use both to make the case. Tom Ripley is preoccupied by fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance. There's also beauty and ideal love, which we don't see so much. The reason Dickie Greenleaf was killed was to achieve some fantasy of success or maybe wealth and status. The Picasso picture was kind of a symbolism for this ideal. Having that on your wall means something. Another point on this, his desire to be invited to all these fancy events. He didn't even seem to enjoy that much, but he loved getting invited and getting recognized, albeit by someone else's name. Next criterion I'm going to talk about is the sense of entitlement that is so clearly palpable in this character. Unreasonable expectations of especially favorable treatment or automatic compliance with his expectations. Very clear example of entitled behavior, asking to get paid by Dickie's father, even though he wasn't going to be able to deliver the service that he was asking to get paid for. I think fraud inherently has an element of entitlement in it, thinking that you deserve something you haven't explicitly earned. More entitled behaviors. When it was time for him to leave, when Dickie asked him, Tom didn't like that. What were you thinking is the question. Like, he was expecting to be living there forever, it looks like, or however long he wanted. And that's not even true for regular house guests, let alone someone you don't even know. Next one is interpersonally exploitative. I don't think this requires a lot of explanation in context of this character, because this whole series is built upon him taking advantage of really everything. Taking advantage of Dickie Greenleaf's father, who had hired him, taking advantage of Dickie, who had opened his home to Tom by stealing his whole life and identity, and murdering him. I rest my case on that one. The next one is the lack of empathy. A planned murder likely has an element of callousness in almost every scenario, because you have to disregard the feelings of the person that you're killing in order to be able to go ahead with something like that. And if you're planning for it, then it means you were able to suspend your empathy for some period of time. However, even if we go with the argument that it was a passion killing, you just see his mannerisms on the boat, how he doesn't really have any remorse even after the fact. Clear lack of empathy there. All right, the last one, arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes. Being a con man inherently requires a level of arrogance. To think you can manipulate reality itself is a bold position, to say the least. But I also thought interviews with the branch inspector were pretty arrogant. It was to the point where I was thinking he's almost challenging the detective, asking questions that made him look more suspicious at times. And really, what would satisfy someone's arrogance more than fooling a detective? Even when we say Tom Ripley is someone with narcissistic personality disorder, it doesn't explain the murders he has committed, as most people with NPD don't go on to commit murders. There are, however, theories on integrating these two aspects of someone's personality when they do indeed co-occur. One of these theories comes from the Austrian psychoanalyst Otto Kernberg. He stated that pathological narcissism is not simply an altered version of normal quote-unquote narcissism rather represents a defensive construction of a pathological grandiose self, consists only of the positive aspects of the person, and all the negative aspects are projected onto others. He uses to explain why pathological characters can be so cruel, because their perspective on everyone but themselves consists only of the rejected, aggressive, hostile components that they couldn't integrate within their own psyche. Where does this come from? Edmund Burglar is another psychoanalyst. He was the one who proposed the idea that all babies are born with a narcissistic instinct. They think they're omnipotent, which tracks if we think about our childhood, like we all thought, it was just us and mom and dad were to serve us. Babies have even more extreme version of that, but then over time it gets broken down. Even in the best household, the baby has to cry before they can be fed, at least some of the time. So the fact that you have to ask for your needs before they can be satisfied, he theorizes, breaks that mold in your head. The universe is there to serve you because it turns out you are in a place of discomfort, at least even briefly, before you can be comforted again. But in the event that you have parents that are very insufficiently attending to your need, these kids can learn to romanticize the discomfort so that they can regain that some sense of omnipotence, because they can't make their parents attend to them, but they can reframe the situation so that they're still in power. And the way they do that is, I like this, I want it to be frustrated anyway. All these primitive defense mechanisms at times still come in each one of our lives, especially when we're not feeling our best. Everyone acts childish at times. Whenever there's something that we wanted but couldn't get, having the idea of never mind, I didn't want it anyway, comes kind of from here. And on that, it's said the price of retaining narcissistic satisfaction becomes extracting pleasure from displeasure. The thing I love to see is when theories on various things kind of overlap, in the sense that if you take a picture of something from different angles and then you put them together and they all make sense, because I think that reinforces the strength of the argument. And this theory from Burglar is similar to attachment theory, where Fairburn, another psychoanalyst, stated that children with abusive parents engage in splitting as a defense mechanism, where they split themselves as a bad person in the interaction, and their parents, who's the person they love, as the good one. And this also lets them still hold on to a hope. If they are one day good enough, they might be able to deserve the love from the parents. Now, one other theory on the origins of personality disorders comes from object relations theory. Object relations theory states that in normal development, representations of self and others become more and more complex and differentiated so as to resemble real life. In these representations of self and others developing, the person integrates the good and the bad, positive and negative aspects of their personality and the world around them so that they can tolerate ambiguity and contradiction. Their world stops being black and white. Through the integration, they're able to see the gray and tolerate it. In cases of mistreatment in childhood, you are unable to understand what a healthy relationship is, what you can expect from people, what they can expect from you, things like that. And you may lack these complex representations of other people and yourself. And this leads to a few things. One of them is that you still are using primitive defense mechanisms as an adult. This is really a hallmark of personality disorders, the use of primitive defense mechanisms. An example from this series would be projection. Tom blaming Marge of being a social climber, stating that she's trying to benefit from Dickie's wealth and that's why she's with him, which it looks like there might be some truth to that. But at the same time, that is exactly what Tom is doing, and he doesn't seem to see the irony of that. The fact that he proves to be a lot more dangerous to Dickie than Marge was. Another thing that comes from this lack of integration in childhood is identity diffusion. This is a fragmented and inconsistent view of self and others as opposed to a coherent one. It can a lot of times be the reason for tumultuous relationships people with personality disorders find themselves in. In a person with narcissistic personality disorder, because they are less concerned with outside people in general, this would be the fragmented sense of self in them, where they have to look at others for reassurance of their importance and significance in the world. Some of this in the series, Tom Ripley wanting to be invited to these events that are held more exclusively. I also thought another symbolic aspect was the camera that he was carrying with him was Dickie's camera that he took. He would unpack it in every hotel room he stayed. I don't think he takes one picture in the whole series, but he kept carrying this camera around. To me, it symbolizes something like he wants to be a person who would be traveling in luxury, where it's all about hobbies and beautiful things and documenting your beautiful life. The last thing that comes with the lack of complex representations is intact but unstable reality testing. Being intact is a juxtaposition to like a psychotic state. Unstable reality testing will present as overvaluing some ideas versus undervaluing others. Specifically, narcissistic personality disorder, I think this would be the idea that you think you're more important than other people in absence of evidence to show that. And this goes back to trait narcissism and how it has an element of the modern day just be delusional trend. The reason we call it a delusion is because there's not necessarily an evidence. With all of these I mentioned, primitive defense mechanisms, overvaluing some ideas over others are things we might all engage in at times, but the main difference comes into play if you know your shortcomings or if you're aware that you're overvaluing this idea versus if you have not actually consciously integrated these aspects to your personality. Then you might be driven by impulses without being able to identify them as this is not really 100% real, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and I'm gonna take a risk. You just think I am better than everyone else, and that's the end of that. Next, I'm going to talk about malignant narcissism and narcissistic rage. Malignant narcissism is another concept that was introduced by Kernberg, and he outlined 4 features that are associated with this syndrome: a typical core narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial behavior, egocentric sadism, and a deeply paranoid orientation toward life. A person with malignant narcissism would be more susceptible to narcissistic rage. The definition comes from Heinz Kohut. He is another psychoanalyst. He observed that narcissistically vulnerable individuals respond to actual or anticipated narcissistic injury with a fight or flight response. Defines the flight response as a shame-faced withdrawal and a fight response as the narcissistic rage. He gives an example of someone who is giving a presentation and misspeaks. In the normal setting, probably say like, oh, let me correct myself and keep going, or maybe laugh it off. But a person with narcissistic personality disorder, if we imagine them giving a big speech to a crowd, this is just too much of a narcissistic injury for them to brush past it. Person with narcissistic personality disorder is going to have an excessive preoccupation with this mishap that has occurred. And in turn, they're going to want to eradicate it by any means necessary, which he theorized may even involve something like doing away with themselves in order to wipe out the memory, which would be fueled by rage that they have. In Tom's case, I would say both murders had an element of narcissistic injury to them, and both were disturbingly violent. So Dickie's murder comes immediately after Tom is asked to leave this trio essentially that they had formed, where Dickie wants to go with Marge on a vacation and be alone again in his house. This reads as rejection from Tom's perspective, and he's offended, I would say, that they're asking him to leave. The rage associated with the killing is depicted in how violent it is. In terms of Freddy's murder, I think the humiliation Tom experiences when he feels like he was found out by Freddy as a fraud. There's also the anticipated humiliation of being declared as such by the public in general if he were to get caught, which he can't risk. We already went over the syndrome of malignant narcissism and how it had antisocial behaviors. Now I want to talk about why I don't believe this character is someone with antisocial personality disorder, but rather they have narcissistic personality disorder, and kind of draw that distinction. First, I'll acknowledge anytime there is a callous murder in play, antisocial personality does come to mind because it's associated with cruelty and lack of remorse. In this situation, Ripley is more concerned with maintaining a facade of wealth and status as opposed to killing because he enjoys the act of killing. After both murders, he is almost annoyed that he has to deal with hiding what he has done. The fact that he does not kill Marge when he has the opportunity because he would rather just have this life that he was envious of, that he believes he deserved. He is willing to kill to achieve that, but killing itself is not for him. On this topic of discussing two different personality disorders that someone might on paper qualify for at the same time, everything I read was emphasizing how personality disorders tend to be comorbid, especially in literature. I read this excerpt from the empirically derived taxonomy for personality diagnosis that says clinical practitioners generally do not confuse these configurations. The problem of comorbidity is not inherent in personality diagnosis, but it is an artifact of abbreviated criterion sets that do not capture the complexity of real life personality syndromes. And this made a lot of sense to me. I like how it emphasizes these things are not just a checklist. That is where the clinical judgment a lot of times comes in. Lack of empathy is another feature that's common to both of these disorders. In the case of narcissistic personality disorder, however, there's a distinction made between cognitive and affective empathy. Cognitive empathy is just registering someone else's emotions, whereas affective is having the motivation to understand what they're feeling. People with NPD are able to process the information that they're getting from others, but they choose not to respond empathically, at least when it's not beneficial to them. I want to leave you with a thought from Dr. Elsa Roningstam, who is an expert on NPD. Traditionally, the striking interpersonal features of NPD have invited conclusions about these patients' personality functioning, hypervigilance, control, etc. All these add to the fluctuating functioning in individuals with pathological narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder with significant reactivity, insecurity, vulnerability, or avoidance underneath a surface of competence or persistent self-enhancement. Similarly, these patients' often eloquent cognitive and verbal interaction can be strikingly opposite to their internal, often underwhelming or relentless subjective experiences, which they can be unwilling or even unable to convey. I find that perspective important to emphasize the fact that the tragic and extreme outcomes are not simply a product of narcissistic personality traits, but rather they're deeply attached to the underlying emotional turbulence and psychological vulnerabilities. It's very important to understand the underlying intricacies of the disorder to even begin to address the psychological contributors to destructive behaviors. And last but not least, what was the message of the series? The few that I thought were possible takeaways. One is trust your instincts, especially for Marge, I think, in the series where she knew something was off with Tom. But in the end, even she appears to have suspended that belief, which is such a shame because I was rooting for her to possibly solve the mystery. Second is not become too fast friends. I'm all for being friendly, but Vicky's decision to have someone who's a stranger move into his house the day after they met, and after learning he had just lied to him regarding their background and his intentions of being there, but I think Vicky was having Tom live with him just to spite his father, and perhaps there's another message about what not to do in there. And the last one, I'll just quote Mark Twain: if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. And this is to say, I don't think Tom's horrible pursuit of status and wealth ever really pays off, because he is having to stay in these motels the whole time, can't even enjoy this apartment that he got that he loved. In the very end, we see him achieve what he wanted, at least for a moment, in this Vienna house with the Picasso on the wall. But then the detective gets the book that Marge wrote with the picture of Vicky in it and seems to put everything together. I think he's gonna go back to Vienna. With that, I don't think Tom is ever going to be able to enjoy what he has acquired. And that's all I have on Ripley and narcissistic personality disorder. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Bye.